In this video, we are going to discuss how to crush the Sicilian defense, and it's a complete repertoire, so I must recommend you to watch the full video. So let's check it out. So White starts the game with 1 e4 and we have c5 by black, and we have the Sicilian defense on the board. And from the move number 2, I must recommend you to play d4. And after seeing d4, we have c3. Black captures the pawn because now black is a pawn up. We have knight into c3. And after knight into c3, there are many options to reach this position. Even at the place of playing d4, you can still play knight f3, because usually after knight f3, black is having three options of playing d6, e6 or knight c6. It doesn't matter what will black play, you can still play d4 and you can still play c3 and you can still reach this position. So after knight into c3, now black is having options, but the most natural option is to play knight to c6. And we are going to develop our second knight, and in this position black is having the options of playing d6 or e6. If first black tries to play e6, then we are simply going to develop a bishop to b4. Black idea is to open up the position with d5 because it's a common idea in the Sicilian defense, and also the second idea could be to play knight f6 and castle. We are going to develop a fourth piece, and after playing bishop c4, black is having the option of playing knight to f6 or knight to e7. First, if black tries to play knight f6, we are going to simply push the pawn hitting the knight. And after playing knight e4, we are going to simply castle. And in this position, black is having the decision to make. He can capture the knight with the knight or with the bishop, because now white is planning to capture the knight on e4. If black tries to capture the knight with the knight, we have b into c3, bishop into c3, and now we have rook to c1, hitting the bishop. Black is forced to play bishop to b4, and now we have knight to g5. And after knight g5, black is having two options. He can play h6 or he can castle in the position. If he tries to castle, then we are going to simply pull our bishop back to d3, aiming for the h7 pawn. There are two main moves in the position. Black can play g6 or h6. If black tries to play g6, then we are going to simply capture the pawn. After king into h7, after a couple of moves, we are going to give a sacrifice. And after king h8, we have bishop g5 hitting the queen. And now black is having still two options. Black can play bishop to e7 or queen to e8. If black tries to play bishop e7, then we are going to give a check. King to g8, we have bishop to h6. And after knight into e5, controlling all the three squares from the white queen, we are simply going to play rook c3 and simply swing the rook, and it's game over for black. And if at the place of playing bishop e7, if black tries to play queen e8 going for a queen trade, then white is simply going to play bishop to f6 check. The king is locked in, so black is forced to capture the bishop with the rook. And after queen into e8, white is simply a queen up, and it's game over for black. So this is what happens if black tries to play g6. So now let's check it out what will happen if black tries to play h6. If black tries to play h6, then we are going to simply play knight to h7, hitting the rook. Rook e8, and now we are simply having the legend move knight to f6. Simply hitting the king and the rook, so black is forced to capture the knight, and now we simply have queen g4 check. We have king f8 or king h8. If black tries to play king h8, then we simply have bishop into h6, and it's a mate on g7. And if black tries to defend the mate, we simply have queen h5, and it's a forced mate now. Even if you can't do anything actually in the position, we are going to simply move a bishop, and it's game over for black. So if black tries to play king f8, then we are going to simply capture the knight on c6. This is a main move, so remember it. The reason behind it is, now if black tries to capture the rook, we have bishop into h6 check. King e7 is forced, and now we are going to capture the bishop on b4. This was the reason we sacrificed the rook for the knight, because the knight was protecting the bishop on b4. And after capturing the bishop, it's a two move mate. After c5, queen into c5, king e7 and queen to d6 is mate. So this is what happens if black tries to play h6 in the position. So now let's talk about what will happen if black tries to play h6 directly in this position. If black tries to play h6, then we are going to simply play knight to e4. And in this position, still black is having the two options. He can either castle or he can go for playing b6. If he tries to castle, then we are going to simply play queen g4. And now bishop into h6 is already very deadly. So black is simply going to move his king. And now we are going to simply pull our bishop back to d3. The idea of playing bishop d3 is to cover the light squares, which are very critical. And after playing rook g8 trying to defend the black king, now we are going to play knight to f6, a legend move. And after capturing the knight, we are going to simply play queen h5. And after queen into h6, it's game over. So if black tries to defend the mate by playing bishop f8, we can still capture the pawn on h6 with a bishop. And if black tries to capture the bishop, it's over. And if black doesn't try to capture the bishop, it's still over because we are going to simply move our bishop and it's going to be game over. So this is what happens if black tries to castle in the position. And if at the place of castle, if black tries to play b6 in the position, then we can simply play queen to h5. And after playing queen h5, if black tries to play bishop b7, we can simply pull our another rook into the game. And now white, all pieces have been developed. So black is like, he has to castle in the position. But at the moment he castles, we are simply going to sacrifice our knight. And here comes rook to d3, a tremendous move. Idea is to play rook g3 and simply hitting the king. And after something like knight into e5, we simply have bishop into e5, f into e5, and queen into h6. You can't give a check directly because after king h7, black can defend the position. You must capture the pawn, and now rook g3 is simply unstoppable and it's game over for black. So this is what happens if black tries to play b6 in this position. So now let's check it out what will happen if black tries to capture the knight with the bishop at the place of knight. After bishop into c3, we have b into c3, knight into c3, and now we have queen d3, hitting the knight. Black is forced to play knight to a4, and after knight to d2, our plan is to simply get the queen into the game. Black castle is in the position, and now we simply have queen g3. Idea is to play bishop h6, going for the king basically. And after playing queen g3, black is having two options. He can either go for playing knight b6, hitting the bishop, or he can go for playing knight to e7. Idea is to, like, you can't go for playing bishop h6 because knight g6 is coming. So first let's talk about knight to b6. We can play bishop to h6. The knight cannot capture the bishop. It's a mate on g7. Black is forced to play g6, and now we are simply going to play bishop to d3. If you try to capture the rook, then after something like queen into f8, it's not much effective. Although you are better, but it's not much effective. You can simply pull your bishop back, and after rook e8, you can simply jump up with the knight. And after knight f6, it's already game over, and you can say you are simply going to win the game. So knight b6 actually doesn't make any sense, but I still covered it. Knight e7 makes sense, but after knight e7, white can simply pull his bishop back, controlling the critical squares. And after something like d6, trying to open up the position, we can simply play knight to f3. And after knight f3, you are not basically capturing the pawn, but you are simply developing the piece. If white tries to capture the pawn, we simply have knight g6, and black can simply develop the bishop. So this is the main problem for white. That is the reason we simply developed our knight. And after black captures the pawn, we are going to sacrifice the bishop. We have a check, and after king g6, we can simply capture the pawn with a check, and the queen is dead. If king tries to go in, we simply have queen h3, and the plan is to play queen h7 checkmate. Rook e8 is forced, queen h7 check, king f8 check, check, and now here we have bishop to g5 check. The queen is attacked, so black is forced to play f6. If black tries to play knight to f6 in the position, then after queen into g7, it's already game over. It's a triple attack on the knight. So f6, and now we have queen into g7 check, king to d6, rook d1, and we got the queen, and white is going to win the game. So this is what happens if black tries to play knight to e7 in the position. So now let's talk about what will happen if black tries to play d6 at the place of e6. If black tries to play d6, then we are simply going to develop our bishop, And after knight f6, we are going to simply push a pawn to e5. Now black is actually having the two options. He can capture the pawn on e5 with the pawn or with the knight. If he tries to capture with the knight, after knight into e5, d into e5, we have the winning move, bishop into f7 check. The king is forced to capture the bishop, and we got the queen. So this is what happens if black tries to capture the pawn with the knight. If black tries to capture the pawn with the pawn, then we simply have a queen trade. Black is having the two options. He can capture the queen with the king or with the knight. If he captures with the king, we have knight g5. Idea is to capture the pawn and attack the king and the rook. And we have knight f5. And after playing knight to f5, you can't actually go for capturing the pawn, because after king to e8, knight into h8, knight into c4, the knight is trapped and black is better. That's why after playing knight to a5, you must go for capturing the pawn on f7 with the bishop. And after h6 hitting the knight, you can go for playing knight to e6. And it's a check. And black is forced to capture the knight because black is actually not having any counterplay. We have bishop into e6, and now we have g5. So basically black is trying to open up the position, but now white is having the strong move h4. So black idea is to play bishop g7, or he can go for capturing the pawn. If he tries to capture the pawn after rook into h4, bishop g7, bishop e3, white all pieces have been like simply active, and black all pieces are simply passive. So I think and there are many weaknesses for black in the position. So despite being a pawn now, black is simply losing the game. So at the place of capturing the pawn, if black tries to defend it by playing bishop g7, simply defending the rook, we simply have h into g5, h into g5. After a couple of trades, it's an even position if I compare it to the material wise, but if I compare this position with quality, then white is simply going to win the game, because black is actually having too many weaknesses. And white all pieces are simply tremendously placed. White is also having the bishop pair. So this is what happens if black tries to play knight to f5. So if black tries to capture the queen with the knight, then we are simply going to play knight to b5. We are not going to for capturing the pawn on e5 with the knight, but first knight to b5. Knight c7 is already very deadly, hitting the king and the rook. Rook b8 is the forced move, because if you try to play king, then after knight into e5 check, king e8, and knight c7 is a checkmate for black. That is why rook b8, and now we have a check. Knight comes back, and now knight into e5 is already very deadly for black. So black is forced to go in with king. And after playing king to e8, white is simply going to capture the pawn. And now black can no longer castle, because black has already moved his king. And here we have e6, and now white is simply going to castle. We have a6 by black, hitting the knight. We have a check, king comes to e7, and now we have rook d1. And if black tries to play b5, one of the most natural move, hitting the bishop and preparing to develop the bishop, we are simply going to play bishop e3. Black cannot capture the bishop, because bishop to c5 is game over for black. So after playing bishop e3, if black tries to defend it by playing knight to e5, covering the c5 square, then we can simply pull our bishop back to e2. And idea is to play simply bishop to f3, hitting the knight, and bishop c5 is already very deadly. So it's game over for black. So this is what happened. So I think I have covered. And if in this position, after playing e5, if black doesn't capture the pawn, and if black tries to play something like knight to g4, then after playing knight g4, white can simply go for capturing the pawn on d6. And after queen d6, white is simply going to castle. And black is going to go for a queen trade, because black is already a pawn up. And after playing bishop f5, white is going to play h3, hitting the knight. Knight to e5, knight into e5, knight into e5. We have knight to b5, and black cannot capture the bishop because it's a mate. So black is forced to play rook c8, covering the square. And now we have bishop to d5, because the rook was attacking the bishop. Now the bishop is attacking the pawn, so we have knight to c6. Now the bishop captures the knight. Rook into c6. If white tries to capture the bishop with the pawn, then after knight into c7, rook c7. It looks like the knight is trapped, but we have bishop to e3 defending the pawn, defending the knight. And in the couple of moves, white is simply going to play rook c1, collect the pawn on c6, and pushes a and b pawn, and white is going to win. So after rook into c6, we have knight to d4, hitting the rook and the bishop. Black plays rook to d6 because now white cannot capture the bishop because the rook is hanging. So white is simply going to play bishop f4, hitting the rook, and now the rook is connected, so white can go for capturing the knight, capturing the bishop. So black is forced to play rook to d5. We have knight into f5, rook into f5, and now we have bishop to e3, hitting the pawn on a7. Black plays b6, and now we have rook c1, and idea is to play rook c8, game over. So black is actually having two options. He can play for f6 or e6. If he tries to play f6, then we can play a4 because f6 makes the most logical sense. And now we have a4. Idea is to play b3 and followed by rook to c7. We have e6 trying to open up the bishop, but now we have a check, another check, and now white is simply going to capture the pawn. So and now it's winning position for white. White is simply going to capture the b6 pawn as well. The bishop cannot move because the rook is pinned, because the bishop is pinned. So after playing rook to c1, if black tries to play e6 in the position, then we are going to simply give a check. King to e7, rook to a8, hitting the pawn, rook a5, defending the pawn and also hitting the white pawn. White simply pull his bishop back to d2, hitting the rook. If black tries to capture the pawn, we have simply check, king to f6, and now white simply captures the bishop, and it's already game over for black. White is simply a piece plus. So I think I've covered every line in every variation. So I think you can definitely go for these how to crush the Sicilian defense. Just practice some games, and I think you are simply going to crush the Sicilian defense. Let me just give you a quick revision of everything. e4 c5, d4 captures. You can also come up with this position if you try to play knight f3 d4 followed by c3. Knight into c3, we have knight c6, knight f3, and there are two moves, d6 e6. It doesn't matter what will black play because first of all the most common move looks to play d6 because in the Sicilian d6 is one of the most common moves. E6 is barely played, but still it is played. But I showed you another line how to simply crush black, how to simply crush black position. Just wait for black to castle, and you can simply crush black position. And here comes, you are simply going to win against the Sicilian defense. So if you like this video, then make sure to like the video. If you learned anything, then make sure to subscribe the channel to support me and to support this channel, because I'm always going to come up with these interesting topics like this. So share this video with everyone so that everyone wanting to crush how to crush the Sicilian defense would be able to know how to crush the Sicilian defense. So I'm going to come up with these interesting topics. So till then, stay tuned and keep watching One Shot Chess.